Oh, there's Jack.
You should be
How
able
are
to
you?
unmute yourself. I've got to.
Good to see you.
Participants. No. All right. Now they can't unmute themselves. Sorry, Mom. You can use the chat. So we are live now, and in just a few minutes we'll get everything going. But I'm now sitting here watching people come in the waiting room. James Croft likes our photo of John Stratton looking fierce. John Stratton generally looks fierce. I don't know if you've run into John Stratton. John's one of my clergy colleagues here in St. Louis, and he has got an organizer's brain, but that's him sort of in the foreground looking angry.
That's the look of an organizer, really. That's just sizing up, figuring out where the systems of power are in the room.
Yeah, that's what he does. Awesome, cool. We're live on Facebook.
All right.
Yeah, and as expected, a bunch of people are joining in right now. So if you're joining, welcome to Theology on Tap. For at least the first little bit, you're not going to be able to unmute yourself. This is my buddy Jack Jenkins, who has joined us. More importantly, this is Jack Jenkins, journalist and author of the new book, American Prophets, which to me looks like it's going forward, but we will see. In just a couple minutes, we'll actually get started. It'll take a little bit for folks to get in and online, but we'll get going. We're going to be following the Theology on Tap format that we would be following if we were at the Schlafly Bottle Works, which is Jack and I are going to have a conversation that you all are in the midst of. You're welcome to use the chat feature to ask questions if you would like. If you're on a computer, that chat feature is down toward the bottom of what's the screen share right now. If you're not on a computer, if you're on an iDevice, there's a little ... that will allow you in. But you can use the chat feature to ask questions at any time. You can also use the chat feature to have a snarky response to somebody else who's in the room if you want. We are recording, so those will be recorded, just, you know, if you're doing the snark. And then after Jack and I talk for about 20-25 minutes, we will ask you all to join small groups. We'll break you up into breakout sessions, and we've got a series of questions for you to talk about together. And we hope you'll stick around for that. And then after the breakout sessions, we'll do some Q&A with Jack. We should wrap up about 7:45 Central Time. That's 6:45 if you're my mom in Denver, or that's about 8:45 Jack's time. And we gotta wrap up because he's got bedtime and things. So yeah, I'm gonna keep admitting people in, Jack, but I think we're gonna go ahead and get started.
Let's go.
So Jack, I'm in the midst of trying to finish a book right now, and mine is a lot thinner than this. This is a lot of work. The thing that's the most impressive to me, like a good journalist, like some huge percentage of this, like that's the notes section.
Yeah.
I don't know.
you got to cite your work.
A whole bunch of work. And I know that a lot of this is not just the work that went into distilling what you've been doing into the book, but it's all of the journalism and all of the work that you have been up to for the last, is it a decade? It's close to a decade.
Right around there, yeah.
Yeah, you and I met first in Washington, D.C. when you were just sort of beginning this religion and reporting gig. You were finishing up your master's degree at Harvard. And we've been sort of, to a degree, like spectating. We were both in DC, and you're still in DC, and spectating the national political scene. I got more of a sense of your writing once I moved here, because you and I were talking a lot while Ferguson was happening. I think when you wrote your first Think Progress report, I was sending you photos from the streets
Oh
from
yeah,
Tracy Blackman's first big protest that she organized.
you're credited in all those
It's been,
photos.
I know so it's not about the credit though. It's partly like we've been having this conversation for a long time, and you do a lot with St. Louis and Ferguson in the book, and I thought that might be an interesting place to start. And when we were talking about this, you said, you like to tell stories, so feel free to tell stories that bring you to your conclusions. But I wonder, how does Ferguson still figure in the conversation about faith and politics right now?
So, excellent question. And in the context of the book, Ferguson is a way to kind of tell a narrative of. Oh,
You lost
did
the
I lose
screen share,
everyone?
but you're still there. No, you're
Oh,
there.
okay, gotcha. In the context of the book, the situation around Ferguson and what makes Ferguson's really interesting is that it is a way to tell the story of Reverend Tracy Blackman, who of course has a church in Florissant, Missouri, and played a prominent role in a lot of the Ferguson demonstrations. But it's also a way to talk about how a lot of faith-based activists in multiple fields, not just on the topic of race, have had to kind of re-earn credibility with this new up-and-coming cadre of progressive activists. And that was really clear for activists who worked in Ferguson. In fact, some of the people I spoke with who, had showed up to advocate and demonstrate in Ferguson after the shooting of Michael Brown, kind of this really linchpin moment for the Black Lives Matter movement. They talked about how they were clergy actually locally in and around Ferguson actually discouraged them from continuing to protest and demonstrate. And as the quote goes, one activist told me they were roundly ignored. And so they continued to stay there and to demonstrate. But, there was this cadre of local clergy who also felt like they wanted to get involved in some capacity. And among them was Reverend Tracy Blackman. And so she, kind of tried to get organize some clergy to come help with the demonstration. And the way she told the story was that she rolled up to this area of demonstration near the police headquarters, and there were already hundreds of people there. And she realized that these were the activists that had showed up the night before and had simply never left. And traditionally, with regards to race, and again, multiple other movements as well, like the church has been one of the leading focuses and organizing hubs for activism. But in this instance, she had shown up basically late to their demonstration. So she went ahead and she went and talked to the demonstrators and said, "Hey, we're going to have some clergy come in." And said, "Okay." And they're like, "Sure, sure." And so she showed up and had them, and they started praying and they started, demonstrating and talking. And at some point, some of the demonstrators who weren't affiliated with the clergy who had showed up, said, "That's enough praying." And they went out into the street and staged a sit down. And people were trying to discourage them, and even some of the clergy were trying to say, that's just going to invite, some sort of retaliation on the part of the police. But then Tracy Blackman went out there and said, "Look," basically did the math in her head. She's like, "I'm not going to get you to move. Can I sit with you and pray with you?" And they were like, "Sure." And it was this interesting moment of, basically coordinating activism as opposed to the church being the central organizer of activism. And that turned out to be a trend throughout a lot of the Ferguson demonstrations. And, I kind of chronicle various different faith leaders that ended up participating. You were sending me pictures from some of those demonstrations. And it ended up being able to forge some connections and alliances between these activists and some faith leaders who they saw as credible in that movement because they had shown up. They had shown up in the street. Some of them had taken rubber bullets to be a part of that. And so what that ended up doing by the end, in as much as Ferguson ever ended, by the time that the national conversation moved to other incidences and tragically the shooting death of more Black men at the hands of police and others, that there was this cadre of faith leaders who had established themselves within the Black Lives Matter movement, or at least as seen as allies of it. And so you started seeing someone like Tracy Blackman. And so the way I tell the story in the chapter is that is why when Charlottesville happened, And there was the night of the Tiki Torch rally, and white supremacists marched onto the university campus there in Charlottesville, holding tiki torches and chanting white supremacist slogans. Across the street from them was a church filled with 1,000 faith leaders listening to a sermon delivered by Tracy Blackman, who had been asked to come in to help inspire activists who were going to demonstrate the next day. And it's kind of telling the story there of how those connections that were forged in Ferguson, and the activists and faith-based groups who started talking about prophetic resistance, those are the terms they used at the time, how that became a key component of activism and faith-based activism there moving forward for the next several years, leading right up until the present day. So that was kind of one of the reasons I wanted to, and she's, Tracy Blackman has since showed up to protests for various different forms. She was very involved in the Affordable Care Act demonstrations. She's been involved in immigration-related demonstrations. I saw her outside the White House last summer, decrying the Trump administration. She's been involved in a lot, but her network, her credibility within activism circles kind of was forged in the streets of Ferguson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Coming from St. Louis, there's a number of folks that seem to have launched from St. Louis, and Tracy is probably the leader that's most trying to have it both ways. I used to joke with her before the pandemic that she had a foot on a plane and a foot in St. Louis at all times, and she always just looked tired from all the travel. But I think that's right. And then we saw folks like Mike Kinman went and got a much bigger pulpit out in California. Sort of a historic progressive Episcopal church on the West Coast. Starsky Wilson's another voice that comes up in the midst of all of that.
Yes.
And I find it interesting. Ferguson has this place in the person in the way you tell it of Tracy Blackman, but there's a number of folks that there's an alliance forged there.
Yeah.
Let's get to the other, you don't start there. I wanted to start there because I think so often this is and all the reporting I've seen about your book is oh, isn't it weird? Somebody wrote a book about progressive politics and faith. Most of the time I think of the religious right. And that narrative you problematize not just from the perspective of hey friends, there is a progressive religious voice, but from how weird the current version of conservative Christianity has gotten in an alliance with Trump, which we could do not just one Theology on Tap, but days and days on that. But so I want to get to what I find to be the weirdest story that I've heard you tell about Trump and religion, which is, can you talk about Trump's faith folks and the Russian Orthodox Church and the KGB?
Yes. To back up a little bit to help give some context for this, one of the emerging truisms of the Trump administration is that his rise to power has really complicated and made an unusual version of the religious right. The religious right that is activated under Trump, it looks a little different from the religious right that existed and predated him just by a year, right? The religious right of 2015 is not the same religious right of 2020 in terms of who has influence and who has the ear of power and conservatism. You saw people like Russell Moore, who helps run the Southern Baptist Convention's political arm, who traditionally would be associated with the religious right, come out as this stalwart opponent of Trump during the 2016 campaign, and has been a quieter but still consistent critic of some of the policies of the Trump administration. And meanwhile, some of the big, heads of Faith and Freedom Coalition or these large religious right organizations have kind of taken a back seat to a group of what were really, what we often describe as prosperity gospel preachers, who have often been kind of distant from the kind of religious right because they haven't been deeply political, and they're the ones who now have the ear of the president. However, there are a few religious right characters who have maintained an affinity for Trump despite other religious right figures or conservative Christians who've kind of dismissed him, and that includes someone like Franklin Graham, of course, the scion of Billy Graham.
Well, and Falwell too, right?
And definitely Jerry Falwell Jr. Yes. Jerry Falwell Jr. Didn't follow in the footsteps of his father in terms of becoming a pastor, but he certainly continued to run Liberty University. And, that's a whole nother topic we could also spend days on. Mm-hmm. But the Russian Orthodox thing, we only kind of mentioned a little bit. I kind of make some homages to it in the book, but I did some reporting on it. There's this interesting connection that kind of immediately predated Trump's rise, where there was this emissary for the Russian Orthodox Church who actually came to the United States and met with a slew of conservatives, among them actually George W. Bush, but also Franklin Graham, and actually went and visited the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, and actually went and visited Billy Graham in Montreat, North Carolina. There's a picture of him, the aging Billy Graham, living in his home in Montreat, meeting with this Russian Orthodox official. Conversely, a couple of years later, you saw Franklin Graham actually visited Russia and met with Putin, and consistently became a defender of Putin in public, and wrote a whole thing in the Billy Graham magazine, basically defending Putin, not saying that he was a perfect guy, but actually kind of comparing him positively in comparison to Obama. And then he had this sort of connection to the Russian Orthodox Church. And actually, when the gathering that Franklin Graham originally wanted to have in Russia, which was this persecuted Christians summit that he wanted to hold, and it had to be rescheduled and was held in the United States. He actually held it here in the United States. And an important thing to know about the Russian Orthodox Church is that it is a faith tradition. It is also, under Putin, become what many analysts believe to be a kind of a de facto arm of the government. It has actually been used pretty frequently in Europe to help wield Russian influence throughout parts of Europe. That's one of those things the scholars just kind of say offhandedly now. It's so common. So to see a Russian Orthodox official, who, for the record, current head of the Russian Orthodox Church, is believed by some, there's some evidence to indicate he was formerly a KGB official. When you saw, a Russian Orthodox official in the United States meeting with Mike Pence backstage, and this was in the midst of the Russian reporting blitz, there was many a thing said about that. All that is to say, there's some unusual and peculiar meetings between Russian Orthodox officials and members of what we would call the religious right that predated Trump's rise. Whether it had anything to do with him is another question, but it's certainly something that made a lot of people's eyebrows get raised.
Well,
and again, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it's not the first that I encountered this was, there's still there's like a Russian Orthodox Church in exile. Like if you go to Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives, there's this beautiful gold dome monastery that they talk about being the White Russians, and it's a group of the Orthodox Church that were the Orthodox Church under the Tsar, and then there were Russian Orthodox in exile, but they've never come back into what we would call communion with Russia. Mm-hmm. And so mm-hmm. they would tell you, yes, of course, the current Russian Orthodox Church is an arm of the state. The resonances for me, I find really interesting is that, the idea of certain elements of the evangelical world learning from the Russian Orthodox how to be the state church,
right,
as an Episcopalian. You've noticed, I've noticed you've avoided talking about like the church in Charlottesville was an Episcopal church. You rib, and I don't know, you and I've ribbed each other about some things, but you start your immigration chapter with a thing about how the church that you're looking at in Arizona is not a vaulted cathedral, and I was like, oh, Jack, get over it. We're Episcopalian. But being a church that has had being in a church that has historically had a close, the other church that had a historic relationship with power in the country. I just find it interesting, like this idea that Trump might be learning from the Russian Orthodox.
Oh yeah,
let's talk about immigration.
Actually, okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Say what you're gonna say.
I was just saying that there is actually you will see some religious right figures kind of, and they've told me in interviews, kind of express almost a fondness or almost a longing to see the kind of attachment to power that the Russian Orthodox Church does. Whether that's still true in 2020, things change so quickly in this political context, it's hard to keep track. But there was this fascinating thing where to say like, oh, they have this religious freedom in Russia, and there's like this supposedly this very positive relationship between Putin and the church, and that didn't used to be the case at all before his third term. And to which the living question when you hear an evangelical Christian say that, it's like, is that the relationship that you want? Is that what you're trying to say? Is that when you say religious freedom, you mean kind of a freedom to have that attachment to power? It kept coming up a lot in my reporting a couple of years ago, and was hard to ignore.
It's wild. It's also why you ended up in a Netflix documentary, which I found really fascinating too. There's a, let's go to immigration though, because we don't have all night. And that for me in your book is like the theological heart of what you are doing. I mean, the theology comes in a number of places, but there's a quote you give from a Methodist pastor who's now a Methodist bishop, Bishop Minerva, where she talks about the practice of sanctuary, and it's almost like it's a spiritual practice. She talks about how immigrants have been providing sanctuary for one another for generations. And and then you sort of spin that in this, when I think new sanctuary movement, I immediately think about like, okay, how do you get enough lawyers together to make sure that you can declare the church, and what about liability insurance? But it's this movement of people sheltering in churches, but you broaden that perspective in a way, I think partly to introduce the theological and the sacramental can you talk a little bit about sanctuary as a theological concept, a political reality, and an organizing principle? Like that for me was one of the most central pieces of the book. So tell stories that illustrate that too.
Yeah, no, I think the new sanctuary movement in particular is this really fascinating encapsulation, exactly what you're talking about, of like, deeply held faith, political strategy, and just elements of theological richness that allows for it to gain media attention. So for those who don't know, there was an original sanctuary movement in the 1980s, and it was the taking in of people fleeing violence in Central America, and a group of churches along the US-Mexico border, just in direct defiance of the federal government, started taking in these groups, these immigrants that the federal government refused to delineate as refugees for a variety of reasons. And so and then there was actually repercussions for this. I mean, these churches actually ended up, and several people got indicted, and a lot of the people involved, were under investigation by the FBI, et cetera, et cetera. But it did end up, it's credited with influencing some immigration policy changes by the Reagan administration. Fast forward to a couple decades later, and under the Obama administration, some people, and a little bit before that, some people started using a new form of the sanctuary movement. And what they did is they were utilizing basically two internal memos that Immigration and Customs Enforcement utilizes. One is this thing called the prosecutorial discretion memo, which basically means they would prefer if they're going to deport people, they would prefer to people who they would prefer to kind of skip over, or at least not concentrate their time on those who have those who have family ties, who don't have a critical criminal record, who pay taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And then in addition to that, they were leaning on this memo that essentially it's not a law, but it is an internal policy at ICE that they don't raid sensitive locations such as churches and schools and hospitals. And so these churches and these synagogues started taking in, and other houses of worship started taking in undocumented immigrants at the risk of deportation, and basically daring the federal government to come get them. And what often resulted instead is they would drop their cases. And it was this interesting partnership between usually like immigration lawyers, some of whom were actually involved in the original sanctuary movement. Some of the people I reference, I interview in the book, were there at the beginning and still there now, as well as people who, just can feel compelled to participate in this as a component of their faith. And what's remarkable about it is that it's this shared ethic that happens across faith traditions, because mosques, as well as Buddhist groups, as well as synagogues, as well as churches, have all signed on to this movement in various capacities, and their participation has only increased under Trump. But this idea of welcoming the stranger and taking that seriously as a spiritual edict, not as like a casual suggestion in the footnotes of the Bible, really helped inspire the action of these folks. And to the point where there are related cases to this where people in lawsuits claim this as a religious freedom issue. Like this is something they feel so strongly that to deny them the right to care for immigrants is an affront to their faith. And like you said, some people who are involved with the movement who are immigrants themselves, or who come from immigrant families, are like, yeah, I mean, this is something that immigrants have kind of done de facto for generations, and also seen it as this spiritual experience. Bishop Minerva Carcano that you were talking about, she, kind of said that, her family used to just have people in her home when she was growing up. And that was just an expression of their faith and an expression of what it meant to be an immigrant. And she saw that as a Christian witness. And then she also, during the original sanctuary movement, was also taking in people into her home as well. And now in 2020, not only is there the new sanctuary movement, which is this very public expression of taking in immigrants and trying to hope that the government backs down, there's also a apparently exploding private sanctuary movement, which is even riskier because there's no policy that protects people raiding homes, and that means that individual people of faith are taking in immigrants and helping them in that regard. Again, because of a deeply held spiritual tradition. There's actually, back in the 80s, there was a pamphlet that the Mennonites put out called The Sanctuary Church. There was this theological document talking about and walking the readers through how this is a form of activism, yes, but it's more than that. This is an expression of the core tenets of Christianity and what it means to care for the other, to care for the stranger. And so, and what I thought was really interesting in my research is that the sanctuary movement isn't just directed outward at society. It also, in its early days and when it had kind of restarted in the 2000s, was directed inward at the church to remind churches and different faith communities of their own values, to remind them that this is important. And when people put their lives on the line that way, particularly the immigrants in particular, but also the faith communities that aid them, it sends a signal to the others in those denominations to say, hey, look, we got to sign on with this at some level. And now we have the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America that is voted to be a sanctuary church, which means something a little bit different than just being a sanctuary congregation. But now this has become something that is almost in the ether, at least at least in many communities who take those parts of their holy scriptures or their holy edicts seriously.
Yeah, no, there's a congregation, Christ UCC in Maplewood in St. Louis, that has been giving sanctuary to a Honduran man, Alex Garcia, for a number of years now. Lacey Clay, our U.S. rep, has written legislation trying to get him an exception and get him some kind of legal status. But as far as I know, I haven't heard anything since February, but as far as I know, he's still in the church, still being held sanctuary. If anybody knows different, let me know in chat, but it's been going on for a long time here locally.
And I'll point out that it's not the only story like that. And in fact, under the Trump administration, there have been what are perceived to be efforts by the Trump administration actually they've started fining people who are in sanctuary. And like basically using that as this sort of deterrent to say, okay, not only we're not going to raid the church, but we're going to fine you hundreds of thousands of dollars every day that you could never pay back to help get you to give yourself up before you get deported. And I should note, similarly, whenever you hear the term sanctuary cities, which has become this concept that is now being litigated, that came from that original sanctuary movement. It was people who were participating in that helped push San Francisco in particular to become what now we would call one of the first sanctuary cities. And that kind of created the template for this thing that now gets bandied about as this vague concept that emerged out of the faith community.
And Trump talks about punishing those cities,
right? Exactly.
Like pretty actively. But it's interesting it's an instance where the church language of sanctuary and this ancient practice of not prosecuting people that are inside of a church, that famous like Hunchback of Notre Dame thing, it becomes the way in which this is engaged on a national level. Mm-hmm. I want to go somewhere totally different. It's something I noticed in your book, and it's something that seems to be continuing to develop even right now. There are a number of significant figures that sort of have cameos, some of them repeated cameos in your book. And I'd like to talk a little bit about a couple of different groups that comes from, but one in particular that I noticed is there are a group of leaders that come from white evangelical circles. Folks like Rob Bell and Brian McLaren and Shane Claiborne, who now draw big audiences in progressive mainline, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Lutheran, Methodist churches. And it's perceived almost like a switching of camps but it's interesting to me that a number of those folks have a big enough voice even in the movement that they've adopted. I'd add to that Rachel Held Evans And then Jen Hatmaker, who I'd not heard of before a few weeks ago, and now she's having a conversation with the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. But have you done any analysis of this sort of like switching camp phenomenon and how that, like, what is that about?
No, this is okay. So I touch on this a little bit in the book, but I'll speak more freely about it because I think it's a phenomenon that's fascinating, which is that you have these evangelicals who end up sitting in the back of the Episcopal churches. Like specifically, that's like one of the through lines. And it is this fascinating development where part of it, I think, is this, from my study and my reporting on modern evangelicalism, particularly white evangelicalism, the lines that you can't cross are red ones. And if you challenge that the orthodoxy, the perceived orthodoxy in evangelical circles, at least in some communities, the backlash is swift. And so with someone like, for instance, Brian McLaren, who was accused of being liberal very early on in his career and kind of fought back against that. And then once he kind of endorsed Barack Obama in 2008 and then officiated his son's same-sex wedding, and then when he started writing about politics, he was kicked from the fold from a lot of evangelical circles. And he brought some people with him, but he found a much more avid audience in mainline circles. And similarly, Rachel Held Evans, she kind of had this, she writes about her journey, about her faith journey, where starting evangelicalism and then just questioning pieces of it and struggling with parts of it before she landed in a different tradition. And I think what's interesting about that is I think I have heard why progressive evangelicals discuss how they would really like to forge this progressive evangelical space. For instance, one of the movements I write about in the book was this red letter revival that Shane Claiborne, this longstanding kind of progressive evangelical activist, who kind of particularly on issues of gun violence and immigration and race is like a stalwartly in supports policies that many would describe as progressive. On issues of, for instance, same-sex marriage or LGBTQ rights, he's quieter, and that's actually gotten him some criticism. But he's been trying, de facto, one way to perceive this is that he carves out this space of activism and advocacy that could provide these sort of people who feel orphaned by evangelicalism a space in which to reside. And when I went to the Red Letter Revival, which was this basically protest, but it was also a tent revival near Liberty University, basically directed at Jerry Falwell Jr. to critique his association both with this administration and also some of the things that he said. You would see these kind of people who felt like excommunicated from the evangelical church, as it were, people I would interview there. And often what I have found is that if they run out of places to go, and if they don't find that community, close by them, where it's like this progressive evangelical space, they don't stay there. They'll just migrate till they find a church or a tradition in which they really find residence. And many of these people have a deep appreciation for ritual and for high church stuff and things that we don't do in the Presbyterian Church necessarily, but the Episcopalians do really well. And they end up really resonating with some of the thinkers and the priests in that tradition. So you find them in the back of Episcopal churches. And you find them working for dioceses. You find them, active in all parts of mainline Christianity, but often in the Episcopal Church in particular. And I think there is an interesting study to be done there of like where these kind of expats from evangelicalism came from and why they landed there. But when I talk to them, in my anecdotal reporting, you often find politics and specific theology, like the main motivating factors for why they left to land in a mainline tradition.
Yeah, well, and I find it interesting. I mean, like the names that you raised, Shane Claiborne is mentored by Tony Campolo, right? And so,
right.
And Tony Campolo, like pretty famously held that same line that you sort of like very quiet about LGBT stuff, or he even sort of holds the traditionalist line, but then his wife doesn't, kind of thing.
Right.
I have found in my career, which now has more than a decade, and which sort of scares me, but at the beginning when it was just Brian McLaren and Shane Claiborne and some of those folks, they weren't sitting in the back, or if they were sitting in the back of the Episcopal Church, they were really quiet about it. When Rachel Held Evans starts talking about it, the number of folks that start appearing in the back of my Episcopal churches increases.
Really?
And that to me, I find really interesting. And I'm sure that's true in mainline traditions. You know, we've got liturgy going for us, but I'm sure that's true that congregations that are showing up in progressive places, you know, at the rally after I'm losing the rally, the Something Our Lives rally after
March for
the
Our
shooting
Lives.
in Florida, March for Our Lives rally,
Mhm.
at LGBT Pride, at things like that, that there's a group of folks that are also disenfranchised that have been reading all these folks and are paying attention, and looking for the church they want to sit in the back pew of, because they're really nervous about getting too over involved like they were in their last tradition and getting burned. But
Yeah.
it's a through line that's in a lot of your reporting, and I think it's interesting that like folks who are sitting in the back rows of Episcopal churches have this big public voice in some places. I'm going to take us to the end of your book for my last question, because I found the way you ended really moving and unresolved. So the last story you tell, and it gets a little bit into the other group of folks that that you sort of highlight are traditional Black church leaders. And that a lot of the main voices of the American prophets, and that even white mainliners are looking at, are folks like William Barber and Tracy Blackman, who was in a tradition, she was in a Black evangelical tradition that wouldn't ordain her, and that's how she ended up UCC. But your last scene in the book is at Mother Emanuel AME in Charleston, where the shooting happened, which for you is going home to South Carolina. And you write this set of sentences that I thought, for me, really helped pull together what it is you're saying. So you say that when Americans think of places where faith and politics mix, few would list Mother Emanuel. This, despite it being a place that helped change state policies, take down Confederate flags from government grounds, and host aspiring and sitting presidents, all after enduring unspeakable tragedy. Then again, perhaps that is why so many people underestimate the religious left. Much of its power comes from religious communities who for so long have been presumed to have none. But as I looked out at the church that day, it was clear that their power remains. And then you talk to an activist from the church who's angry about gun laws. And he knows that politics have to change, but he's angry. And it's sort of where I think a lot of us are, especially around the issue of gun violence, is we're angry. So I'm going to ask you to take off your reporter hat for a minute, go back to your organizing roots, and tell me, how would you tell the progressive faith community to work on gun laws? With what you know now, what would be a strategy?
Well, I unfortunately, I've had to leave my organizing past behind. What I can tell you is what I have seen work. And I think this is actually, so I kind of cheated, because when the book was getting really long, and like you said, there's like 50 pages of notes, and I had to I've already taken grief for not having a list of names at the end in terms of like where you could find them, an index, and then there was too many more. And so I wanted to write one more chapter. And if I was going to do one more chapter, I was going to be on the gun violence debate, because the progressive people of faith have actually played a profound and outsized role in that debate for quite some time. And one of the unspoken elements actually of the March for Our Lives rally, while that was absolutely run and organized by those kids out of Florida in Stoneman Douglas High School, it's notable that many of those kids, actually, I spoke to one or two of them while I was there in DC, who were at specific faith gatherings, because that was what animated them. And that a lot of the people who were in the crowd at that rally had been bused there by churches, because they had already had this pre-existing network of faith communities that wanted to act on gun violence, and get gun violence prevention legislation passed. So what I think is interesting is that when it comes to the question of gun violence, we had this moment, under the previous administration, where Episcopalians in particular, but also a wide spectrum of faith communities came together to try to get some gun violence prevention legislation passed. And the problem is it didn't work. Like they even had some religious right figures on board with that, and they weren't able to pull it off. And so when you had this outcry from high schoolers, there was this hope that maybe the youth will be able to bring this as like an issue that people will actually vote on as opposed to show up. And I think that's the interesting question that I've heard from gun rights activists in the faith community is that, one of the things about the religious left, and I talk about this throughout the book, the reason I call the book American Prophets is because the religious left has often operated in what's often called the prophetic tradition, this idea of decrying power, and through that using the art of protest, whereas the religious right has been very good at utilizing their power in the courts and their power at the ballot box. The religious left has often executed power through protest. The great example of the 20th century is the civil rights movement, as showing that you can actually move legislation and change laws and change public consciousness through that element. The problem with that is that you have to, if you want to change something like gun rights laws and you're not able to get legislation through Congress, then it needs to be something that people vote on. And the great challenge that you've heard several people like William Barber and many other activists that I mentioned in the book trying to hammer home is that those are the kinds of issues that people need to not just show up to demonstrate for, but need to vote on and convince others to vote on. Because if you make it a topic of conversation about whether or not you support a candidate is whether or not they are going to take action on gun laws, that's how you could change the face of Congress, and that's how you could change the path to victory for a piece of legislation if you wanted to pass gun violence prevention legislation. And that seems to have been the big hill because, as many have argued for quite some time, the NRA has disproportionate power in Congress compared to the actual size that it has. I mean, there's this famous line that I believe was delivered at the National Cathedral by the Dean of the National Cathedral at the time during this last gun violence push in like 2013. Where he said, the gun lobby is no match for the cross lobby, because in terms of raw number of people and raw amount of money you could dedicate to this, NRA is far outstripped by these other people. But the problem is that the activists haven't proven to lawmakers that they will face repercussions on election day if they don't move on these pieces of legislation. So that has been something that came up a lot in my previous reporting on this topic among activists as the goal is to get lawmakers to fear the cross lobby or the faith lobby in general on this issue.
Yeah, I think that's a really profound point. And today, I learned just today that they reintroduced a provision in the Missouri legislature, which is in session specifically to deal with coronavirus issues. But they're going to pass another gun law that we've been fighting for 2 years at least now, that would force churches to become open carry zones.
Wow.
So I've called the Archbishop's office because last time that they did that publicly, the Archbishop threatened to sue them, which that's an effective mode sometimes of organizing too. But it's amazing to me that they feel like they can get away with that right now. It's sort of amazing. We're going to do a bit of a transition. So I'm going to send folks into small groups. There is a set of questions. It's up at pubtheologystl.org. I just put that in the chat. I'm going to read those 3 questions out for you all, and then you'll be in the small groups. Then at the end of the small groups, I'll close the small groups, invite you all back in, and we'll do some Q&A with Jack. So here are your 3 questions to talk amongst yourselves. The first is, name a cause or an issue that is particularly close to you. How does that cause or issue, how does it intersect with your faith? And could you work on that cause with your faith community? The second came from Jack, but was basically my master's thesis, so I was happy. There's a reason we're friends. Have you ever been inspired by worship or at a protest? Was it the songs? Was it hearing a certain speaker or preacher? Where did that happen? Tell the story. What are the resonances between worship and protest? And then finally, I need your advice. What are the avenues for working on justice with or without your faith community in the midst of a pandemic? So if you'd solve that one and come back to the big group and let us know how we do that, we would really appreciate it. So I'm opening the rooms, and you've all been invited. If you go to your individual breakout rooms, and I'll bring us all back at about 7:30.